Good morning. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson. We're continuing our study of the resurrection of Jesus, and we're in Luke's Gospel, and we're going to be reading Luke verses 36 through 43. This really is connected. It is the aftermath, it is the continuation of the events of the Road to Emmaus trip. So let's read verses 36 through 43. And while they were retelling these things, or telling these things, he himself stood in their midst. But they were startled and frightened and thought that they were seeing a spirit. And he said to them, "Why are you troubled? And why do doubts arise in your hearts? Look, my hands, my feet, it is I myself. Touch me and see, for a spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have." And while they still could not believe it for joy and were marveling, he said to them, "Have you anything here to eat?" And they gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their sight. Okay, so this is really a continuation of what we just talked about. So let's put events in sequence. Sunday morning, the women go. They see the tomb empty. They come back and report it to Peter. Peter sees the tomb empty and comes back and reports that to the disciples who are gathered together. They don't know what to make of any of it. Cleopas and his friend then leave, um, and they had the experience of Jesus on the Emmaus Road. So, in Luke's gospel, the first people to actually see the risen Lord um, it would be Cleopas um, and um, and his friend, maybe. Because after they come back, they find out that there have been other sightings. There have been other events, particularly Peter um, has a one-on-one with Jesus, which Paul reports in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 1 through 10. We don't have it recorded elsewhere, but we have it referred to here. And so everyone's excited. In the middle of the night, they're sharing back and forth the experiences of having seen the risen Lord. And as they're excited and sharing these stories, while they're telling these things, Jesus himself materializes in their midst. He's there. John describes a room with the door locked. Um, and Luke said that whenever they were sitting at table sharing bread, he disappeared before their eyes. He dematerialized before their eyes. So this event is lest we doubt that Jesus is resurrected in a bodily form with flesh and bone, and blood. He didn't say blood, but his blood continually cleanses us of our sins. We're told in 1 John chapter 1. We have a person who is embodied. His body, his resurrection body, has not yet been glorified by God, Philippians 2, because it's still here on earth. But he has a resurrection body. That body is not bound by the three-dimensional world that we live in, but it is a corporeal body. It is a flesh and bone body. And to prove that, Jesus says, look at my wounds. Look at my hands. Look at my feet. Something that he does for Thomas, who may or may not have been here at the time, if this is the same event that John talks about in John 20. Look at my hands. Look at my feet. If you need to touch them, then, touch them. Now, I didn't read verse 40 because I'm reading the New American Standard. New American Standard doesn't include verse 40. It just gives you a note that some manuscripts add, and when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. Well, it's not in the oldest manuscripts. It's not in the Papyrus 75 that we talked about earlier, which is the oldest text of Luke that we have, text fragment that we have. It's not there, not to be found there. Does it matter? No, not in any way does it matter. Um, um, so he's showing them his hands and his feet. Um, I'm not a ghost. I'm not a spirit. A spirit doesn't. I have a body, and not that Jesus is hungry, but he asks, "Do you have any fish?" Sure, here, give me some, and he eats it in front of them. as he eats breakfast with the disciples in John 21. And so we have um, given to us these two bits of evidence that Jesus is not a hologram and he's not a ghost. He's there there's a bodily resurrection. Bodily resurrection. He can show us his wounds. Does he still have them to this day? When we get to heaven and we see him in his glorified resurrection body, which John did at the beginning of the book of Revelation, and we see him that way because he's still fully human and fully divine. Paul makes that clear in Colossians, first of all, and John makes it clear um, in First John and in the book of Revelation. But he doesn't mention wounds. That doesn't mean they weren't there; just he doesn't mention it. So I don't know. He's able on earth before his resurrection body is glorified. Something that Paul describes in Philippians chapter 2, beginning with verse 1. Um, um, he can show them his wounds, and he can eat fish, and proves that he's there in bodily form. This is not a hologram. This is a bodily resurrection. This is important because it will not be before the end of the first century. There will be second generation Christians, third generation Christians. Paul addresses it in Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 15. John addresses it in almost everything he ever wrote. That this was not a bodily resurrection. He only appeared to be alive. No, Luke tells us, no. People were there. They saw his wounds. They saw him eat. He was there in body. Okay, we're going to finish Luke's gospel next time and pick up with verse 44. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the word.